So thank you very much for letting me present this. Thank you, Peter Danko. If you have questions, as Ines just said before, just raise your hand. We will see that in WebEx, and I will let you ask the question as we go along. Also, we have a possibility to ask questions in the end. So the subject of today was e-invoicing from a user perspective, and it will touch upon many of the topics that we have mentioned before in these webinars. I can see, I recognize many of the names of you joining here, so you have perhaps joined on the eDelivery or on the European standard. And some of the things that we will talk about today will be slight repetitions, but we will not go into that much technical detail, but more to see this from a user perspective. So let's get started. So why e-invoicing to start with? We have many arguments for why we should use e-invoicing, and I have a few on them on the slide here. That it can enable quicker payments, better quality. It's good for environment. Actually, that's a significant aspect. It saves times and cost savings. The security is better. Also, from a supplier perspective, it might be that I invoice because my customer requires me to do it, or even I'm required by law to invoice electronically. Or, as we are going into now, the public sector has to implement electronic invoicing because of the directive. So, before we go into more detail, I will just mention again a short introduction to what's being required by the European on the directive of invoicing. The background is that in Europe we have seen that many standards have been used, domestic ones, international standards, but also different implementations of the same standards. So we can have hundreds of different variants of the use of EDIFACT or UBL or cross-industry invoice or other standards. So we have, even though there have been many international formal standards, there's a lack of normative contextualized standards for European perspective. So how to implement the international standard with the VAT aspects, for example. There's always code values and business rules that need to be added on top of the format. Also, we have different approaches and ambitions in the member states. Some have come quite far, others have almost not started at all. And the directive, sets a minimum requirement on the public sector in Europe. The directive says that the benefit of electronic invoicing are maximized when the generation, sending, transmission, reception, and processing of an invoice can be fully automated. And this is something that we will talk about today, these words, the generation, the sending, the transmission, reception, and processing. Also, the directive says that a mere image file, so just a picture of an invoice, is not to be considered as an electronic invoice of the purpose of this directive. So it should be a structured format where the information elements are possible to extract and to use for automation. So further on in the directive, it says that the receipt and processing of electronic invoices, the requirements are on the contracting authorities and entities. So all the member states shall ensure that all the public entities are able to receive and process electronic invoices. So that is, so they should be able, they should stand ready, and they should have the possibility to process electronic invoices, which comply to the new European standard. And also, to make this extra complicated, the European standard, which is the business terms of an electronic invoice, can be expressed using different syntaxes, and the directive says that the receiver must support any, that is all, of the syntaxes on a specific list. So, looking at this again, we have, you can see now on the right side here, the semantic data model is the business terms, the rules, and they have bindings to syntaxes. Syntax A and B. This is Oasis UBL and UNC cross-industry invoice. These are the two syntaxes that all the public entities in Europe must support. Also, we mentioned that an electronic invoice, in its definition by the directive, means that it has been issued, transmitted, and received in a structured electronic format, which allows for its automatic and electronic processing. So just to give you an example, what is not an electronic invoice, it is if I send you a paper invoice and you as a receiver, you scan it and you're processing it electronically. That is not considered electronic invoice in this perspective, because it should be issued and transmitted electronically. So these are some of the important concepts now that I'm not going to go into detail on this, but we have the semantic model, the business terms, we have the list of syntaxes pointing to UBL and cross-industry invoice, and we have the syntax bindings, which are how you represent each business term in these specific syntaxes. And as a supplier, you can essentially choose which one of these syntaxes you support. It's the requirement to support both are on the public entities. So let's take a look on these concepts that we talked about: the generation, sending, transmission, reception, and processing. So starting from the supplier perspective, creation of the invoice. Here we have many options. It can be created directly from the ERP or accounting system. This is normally done in an internal format, in-house format, which is later on transformed or converted into a standard format for exchange. But it's still an option that the accounting system or ERP system creates the invoice directly. But there's also a possibility to use web portals, either if the customer points you to a specific portal or a web page where you can enter your invoice manually. It could also be that you, as a supplier, have found a service online where which you find to be useful, and you can issue several customers through the same portal. There's also a concept called printer capture, or virtual printers sometimes. It is when you install a software on your computer or where you have your accounting program or accounting system, and when you're printing your invoices, the data is captured and transformed into an e-invoice. And finally, service providers. These are third-party actors offering value-added services, such as conversion and also transmission of invoices. And depending on the supplier's volumes of invoices, often one of these options are more preferable than others. For example, if you have thousands of invoices each month, a web portal is probably not a good solution. Then you would rather create it from your accounting system, or perhaps use a service provider to convert those invoices. But there are several options depending, and what we have seen so far is that often these options are they fit well for big companies, but also for small companies with small volume. So there are normally solutions for all sorts of suppliers. So that was generating the invoice. Looking at the sending, and this is something that we tend to forget when we talk about the directive and the new standard. The standard is the data model, the business terms, and the formats. It doesn't say how the invoice is transmitted. So this is outside of the directive. And of course, the transmission of the invoice is not a small challenge in itself. So this is something that the member states have to figure out how to address. Either to just leave it up to the market or up to each trading partner relationship, or there can be some more centralized policies on this. When talking about transmission, sometimes we use the concepts of the four-corner model, three-corner model. Um, the four-corner model is when the buyer and the seller gets help from each of them a service provider. So through a service provider, you connect to a network with other service providers. An example of this is Peppol, which is an eDelivery network where service providers offers connectivity. The three-corner model is when the buyer and the seller are using the same platform. Often they are required then to use the same platform. So that is another alternative. Sometimes in some countries there is a central hub that is mandatory to use. This can be considered to be a three-corner model. There are also combinations of these. Peer-to-peer is where you have direct connection between the buyer and seller. And it's not uncommon to use email. But there are challenges with emails, both with the fact that we are talking here about structured formats, which are then have to be managed by the receiver in a more automatic way. But and PDF is often a solution to combine with email. PDF in itself is not following the definition of an eInvoicing according to the directive, because it has to be structured and so on. But there are also something called a hybrid approach, which means that it's a PDF plus XML. Examples of that is Zuckfert. So and that approach is also possible then to combine perhaps with email. But I think that using email is essentially not a good way forward. That is hard to maintain, and the security is not very good. So the interconnectivity with the customer solutions, that's very important in this area. So when it comes to the reception, what do I as a buyer have to have in place? I need to have a service for the technical entry point, an access point. And if I'm a public entity, I need to support several formats, at least both the formats on the list required by the standard. The things like the connectivity with other service providers, that's a very important aspect that needs to be figured out when the buyer is choosing his inbox or his entry point. So depending, for example, if I have suppliers in many different industries and perhaps in many countries, I need to have a solution that can enable them all to connect to me. If I only have a few suppliers with perhaps a high volume, then perhaps we can find something in common that is a simpler approach. But if you need interoperability with many, then the connectivity is very, very important. So the connectivity on the access point level, that's one thing that has to be in place. Also, for the processing after the reception, the buyer needs to have some kind of workflow support for handling the invoices in an efficient manner, for presentation, visualization, and the approval process. And sometimes these are integrated in the ERP system of the buyer, but often it's also separate services. So you have a dedicated eInvoicing solution, which is integrated with your ERP system. And this depends a bit about on the offerings of your softwares. Of course, the ERP and accounting solution is used also for the payment initiation. So looking at this kind of flow below here, an invoice comes in from the left to your service provider. It's being handed over to a workflow, and the payment is then issued by the ERP. And this all have to be integrated. One aspect that is also important is to think carefully on how you want to handle and assess and approve the electronic invoices. There can be centralized approaches or decentralized approaches. Um, for for all those invoices that are not automatically matched, I will come back to those in a moment. We have to have a manual assessment. Uh, Typically, we're using references in the invoice, so the invoice can be forwarded directly to the person who is responsible for the purchase, so that he or she can make sure that this is a valid purchase, and it can be approved. And this requires a workflow system. The data quality of the reference values is a big concern, and it also a risk. It can cause a lot of costs and trouble if you, for example, are using references in the invoice that are complicated to remember by the purchaser, or just if they are missing, if you're not communicating them well to your suppliers. So this is a business term in the European standard called customer reference, or the buyer's reference. Can't remember exactly now. This is what we're talking about here. In a paper invoice, it sometimes says your reference, that value. It's sometimes hard to make the suppliers to provide this reference correctly. And without the reference, the invoice is stopped early in the process, and in the workflow, where it has to be manually forwarded to the correct person, and it takes time and efforts. So that is to have a central management means that all the invoices comes to a single point where they, like a spider function, is then sending them out to the correct person, or a decentralized, then you relying on these references and letting the workflow system distribute the invoices automatically. So one aspect also that's important to get the full benefit of invoicing is the straight-through processing. That means that the content of the invoice is used to automatically from a machine perspective, a computer is assessing and approving based on different values. And so, for example, we can have order references. The purchase order that I sent to my supplier is mentioned in the invoice, and when the invoice arrives, I can match my invoice towards the order, and I can verify that this is what I ordered. I perhaps have also made a delivery, or a receipt. I've logged that I've received the goods, and the invoice can be paid directly. And approved directly. So that is one type of invoices. Depending on the business model of the buyer, this is perhaps more or less relevant that you use purchase orders in this sense. Almost all suppliers buyers have periodical invoices. Things like subscriptions, electricity bills, telecom, and other invoices that refer to a specific object somehow. This requires that you have a registry of these objects, and that the invoice can be matched towards that registry. And for each object, you have then set some values like max and minimum or allowed variances. So if the rent is exactly this amount, then it will be paid automatically. Or if the invoice bill for this number is within 20 euros or 10 euros from a specific value, then it will be automatically approved. This also can result in positive side effects, such as identification of unused phone subscriptions. This is often mentioned as one of the things that happens, that when you start to register all your subscription or phone subscriptions, the invoices arrives with a very low value, perhaps even with 0 minutes of calling, and you find out that, okay, here we have a subscription to a phone which is actually not used by anybody, so we don't have to keep it. So that is often mentioned as a benefit. So looking again from the buyer's perspective, so what happens when the invoice is received? I'm going through this quite quickly. Let's say the invoice comes in, it goes through my service provider in this scenario. The service provider is integrated with my eInvoicing workflow, where the invoice is first verified that it's a valid supplier. In this case, it is a valid supplier, so the invoice is also forwarded in the workflow to the person who did the purchase by using this buyer reference. And that person says, okay, I did, this is a valid purchase, I approve this. It might, depending on the workflow, it might be sent to his boss or his responsible person, who is also then approving the invoice for payment. Then there is an integration to the accounting system or the ERP system, which initiates a booking of the invoice and the payment, initiates the payment. So this is like a sunny day scenario where the invoice goes through the workflow and gets paid. If we have straight through processing, instead of a person in the workflow, we go through a similar process that the supplier is verified that it's a valid supplier, but the invoice is not forwarded to a person. It's forwarded to a system or a function that verifies against an object registry. So is this a valid phone number, and has it an okay amount? And based on that, it will be approved. Or if something is wrong with that invoice, it goes for manual processing. And when implementing this in large scale, as we are now looking at in Europe with the new directive, you will also start receiving invoices from suppliers which you have not received invoices from before. Just as you do with paper invoices, you might get the first invoice, for example, from a new supplier. These should not be sent directly out for approval. They need to be registered and approved as suppliers. So you have to have some kind of workflow handling for queuing these up for specific handling of new suppliers, unknown suppliers. This is from a security perspective, it's important. So this e-invoicing workflow is a key functionality in implementing invoicing from a buyer's perspective. It can be an integrated part of the accounting system. It can be a separate solution, depending on each case. So I'm just going on here, talking a little bit about the transmission of invoices. We had the four-corner model. Some characteristics of this is that the buyer and the seller, they are free to choose the service provider that they prefer, and the service providers, they have some kind of collaboration agreement so they can communicate with each other. Some of the benefits with the four-corner model is that it becomes very clear where the message exchange take place and to what is the format, the standard that we are talking about. It's what's being exchanged between the service providers. So the four-corner model is transparent in this sense. The three-corner model means that the buyer and the seller are using the same solution. So I just upload my invoice and you download it, essentially, or I enter my invoice and you get it from the platform. This is a common solution. Some question that may come up is, what is the agreed message format which I sent? If I upload my internal format and you download it in the standard format, on whose behalf did the conversion take place? And at which moment in time did the message actually being transmitted? These are some of the questions that are less transparent in the three-corner model. And the peer-to-peer, that is simple in the sense that the buyer and the seller, they connect directly to each other. But that's perhaps the only thing that's simple with it, because if you want to support thousands of trading partners, this can be quite messy as a buying entity to technically maintain and host. So this is not that very common. So there are challenges with most models. Onboarding of trading partners, often it requires testing and configuration. So you need to make a small project of each onboarding for each service, for each trading partner. There's also a lot of different business models in place around Europe for how the service providers connect. And also sometimes you have to charge for each trading partner that you connect. Sometimes you also have to pay for each invoice being sent, and sometimes there is also roaming fees. These traditionally in the four-corner model, all these addressing and the onboarding and the technical things that's necessary to connect a specific buyer with a specific seller is statically configured. So it's a one-time configuration you do when you set up a new trading partner. And over time, you build up lots of these connections, which means it's also hard to change to a new service provider, because then you need to connect them all again. And then specifically, if you have paid for each connection, you might run the risk that you have to pay for them once again. So the migration between service providers can be complicated. So here comes then in an answer. The CEF eDelivery, or also the where Peppol is an example of this infrastructure. It offers dynamic addressing, and this is a key functionality. It doesn't necessarily sound very important, but the point is that I, as a buyer, is registered in the infrastructure, connecting me to a specific inbox or an access point, and the sender's access point makes a dynamic lookup every time he sends something and finds out where to send the invoice. Instead of having statically configured connections, this is instead dynamically discovered for every invoice being sent. This is for mass adoption, and particularly if it's cross-border, this is very, very important. It makes the migration between service providers much easier too. Also, I want to mention a little bit about the response functionality that is provided sometimes of the service providers. This is something that is not mentioned in the directive or the European standard itself, but is often offered by different infrastructures. I see now that this slide is a little bit hard to see exactly what's going on here, but the point is that when I send my invoice to you, as soon as the message has been transmitted technically, I get a transportation acknowledgement back. That is a normal functionality of the transport protocols used. But then after that, there's possibility that if the invoice is invalid or if it's incorrect, I can get a response back on the message level, saying that, sorry, your invoice is not following the standard, or something along that line. And then the last level is when the invoice comes all the way into the workflow system, and I figure out that I didn't do this purchase, and I want to send a message back to the supplier, or the order reference is incorrect, or the buyer reference is incorrect. Then we have another level, like an invoice message response. Some of these responses are used. I know, for example, in Spain, you have many status messages being sent for where in the process the invoice is is at, if it's approved or if it's not approved yet, and so on. In Peppol, there are projects going on for the invoice message response and the message level response. So these response functionality is dependent on the infrastructure you choose as a buyer and the seller. So I'll give you an example. I see that there are some of the Swedish participants here in the list today, and some of you have seen this before when I've been talking about the typical buyer. Sorry about that. But anyway, what we see here is what have happened over time. A typical buyer, let's say a municipality, they have an e-invoicing and e-procurement system, and they have started with EDI invoices. So they have a service provider, and they have suppliers sending invoices through file transfer to the service provider. So this is where they started. But over time, they wanted to connect to more of the suppliers, and they found out that, okay, let's connect to this invoicing network. So they've added more and more connections to other providers of different solutions, like three-corner solutions. So they now have several ways in for invoicing. And they even set up their own supplier portal where some suppliers may send in or key in their invoice manually. And this is not an uncommon situation, at least for what my experience from a Swedish perspective, that when the municipalities and the regions and the authorities, they want to have higher and higher levels of e-invoicing, they need to connect to more and more different solutions, which often then is also resulting in more costs for the buyer. When you introduce eDelivery or Peppol, the question comes up: so why should I connect? And this is a critical strategic IT question for the buyers. So which provider or which system should I use for my connectivity to the eDelivery network? And there are several questions that need to be considered here, such as, is it only invoices I'm going to use, or will I also be connecting with orders and catalogues? Are there and things like, is this something that is already offered by my service provider? Is it free? Is it already free of charge? Is it something that I have to pay for, to tender for? There's many questions for those who are planning to connect to a eDelivery network. I just want to mention this as in the possibility for dynamic discovery. You only need to connect once, and this is different from back in the old days where you had to connect to many different solutions. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about the procurement and payment process. We will not go into detail on this due to time, but the potential with full e-procurement is much higher than e-invoicing only. We say that if you order the correct items from the contracted supplier using the correct prices in a simple way, you get the correct items delivered at the correct time to the correct location, and you have then automated approval of the invoices which are paid in time and correctly booked. And if you have all of these capabilities in place, you get lower prices, more loyalty to your contracts, better monitoring, better rational and smooth process, and you see lots of benefits. So here is really the big next step after introducing e-invoicing. And it can be questioned, is e-invoicing the best starting point? In the business process, you start with the price list and the orders. Isn't that where you should start? It can be argued that way, but on the other hand, electronic invoicing is very, very key functionality for the buyers and sellers, and it's a low-hanging fruit to start with. But with full e-procurement, more benefits can be reaped. There are standardization ongoing similar to what's been done with the European standard for e-invoicing. Another technical committee in CEN, TC440, is developing standards for e-catalogues, e-ordering, dispatch advices, and it's also then harmonized with the invoice. That is the post-award part. There's also the tendering part of the pre-award with notification, the submission, and evaluation and awarding process, which is also supported by electronic messages using XML, Oasis UBL. So this is something that is being standardized now. It's already in place in many countries, the use of this. The work in TC440 is about making it a higher level of standardization, more normative, but of course, e-business has been available for a long time. So, and particularly the post-award parts are mature. The pre-award are less tested in the sense, in the way that we work, but definitely the post-award is already well used. And for the payment reconciliation and reconciliation process, so far we've been looking at e-invoicing and how it's been created, how it's been sent and received, processed, and then it gets paid. We just refer to that. But a little bit, it was mentioned a few things about the payment process. This is also something that particularly the suppliers can automate and have benefits if they can have an efficient reconciliation process. They send out all these invoices and they get money back on their account. And then they need to check that each invoice that was sent has been paid. Often payments are done in batches, so it's not easy to find a one-to-one correspondence with the invoice. For example, you might have an invoice and a credit note, which is crediting half of the value of the invoice, and the customer is just paying then half of the amount. So the amount is not what you find in the invoice. It's a consequence of the invoice plus the credit note. So this is a challenge for the supplier because they need to connect each payment to specific to the transactions in their systems. So we can also see that the remittance information can be used. So if I refer in the invoice to a specific event, that can be used in the information that's being sent back to the supplier. So here we have elements in the invoice, like the remittance information BT83, can be used by the supplier to provide the reference back to the credit transfer initiation. This can automate the handling of the matching. So I noticed that we got a message from let's see on the chat. No? Okay. It was about these slides, the last couple of slides I've used from the CEN BII work, where I just saw the message being flashed by, but I think someone in the audience were part of that work. It's been probably contributed by Italy in the beginning of the work. So I think you recognize the slides. Sorry if I didn't contribute them to you. But anyway, this part of the process where the information in the invoice is sent back together with the credit initiation and in the account statements. That makes the payment process reconciliation much easier. So this is functionality that is supported by the standard, but it's also dependent on the relationship with the bank and in the country, whether or not this is supported in between the bank systems. So, in summary, it's the implementation of e-invoicing. It is a change process, both for the supplier and the buyer. So it's not only supporting the new standard and getting an inbox for electronic invoices. It's also to reap the benefits. You need to implement these changes in your processes. So knowledge and commitment is necessary. Both the customer and the seller have much to gain from e-invoicing. Even though it can be seen that the customer side might have more gains. But if you also go into e-procurement, both the buyer and the seller have a lot to gain from having to digitalize these processes. There are many different alternative solutions, also for SMEs, as I mentioned in the beginning. There are many service providers available that can offer solutions for all types of companies. And with full e-procurement and structured payments, the suppliers have many benefits. So these were the slides and the presentation on the user perspective of e-invoicing. As you have seen, we have gone through many of the aspects that we talked about in earlier presentations. If you have questions, you are free to ask them now, or you can also post them on the wiki.